Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We are learning Mishnah Yesika, Perek Gimel, chapter 3, Mishnah Dala, Mishnah 4. Today we'll be doing 4 and 5. Rabbi Shmuel says, Shloisha Hadasim, when you do the mitzvah of the Dala Minim, of taking the 4 species, you take 3 Hadasim, Ushtei Aravis, 2 Aravis, Lulav Echad, 1 Lulav, the Esrig Echad, and 1 Esrig. Got that? 3 Hadasim, 2 Aravis, 1 Lulav, and 1 Esrig. Then Rabbi Shmuel says, Afilu Shnayim Ketumim, even if 2 of them are cut off on the top, Ve'echad Eina Katum, and 1 is not. So now he's going back on the 3, which is the Hadasim. He's saying even if 2 are clipped on top and 1 is not, it's kosher. Now, that's very hard to understand, because if being clipped is an invalidation of the hadas, then why? And you need 3 of them, so why is 1 enough? If it's not a validation of the hadas, then why have 2? Why you have to have 2? Why only 2 clipped off? All 3 clipped. So the Gemara explains very interestingly that within this same statement of Rabbi Shmuel, he actually started off holding one thing, and then he switched over to another thing, or at least a different later in time, but it was combined together. So Rabbi Shmuel originally said you need 3 hadasim. And if you need 3 hadasim, then all 3 of them can't be clipped on the top by the stem. The top stem can't be clipped off, because because if it's clipped, it's not a kosher hadas. So when he first said you need 3 hadasim, he was holding you need 3 hadasim that have to be kosher, of course. But later on, he actually fell off of that opinion, and he switched, and all you need is 1 hadas. And therefore, if all you need is 1 hadas, then theoretically, if 2 of them are clipped and 1 is not clipped, you still have the mitzvah. Because all you need is 1, and as long as that one's kosher, that's good enough. The other 2 that are clipped are invalid anyway, and whether they're there or not really doesn't make a difference. But it seems like, being that his original statement was 3 hadasim, instead of just switching over to 1 hadas, he said that, you could actually have 2 clipped and 1 kosher, 2 clipped and 1 not clipped, because all you really need is 1 hadas. Rabbi Tarfon says, Afilu shloishton ketumim, all 3 of them can be clipped on top. According to Rabbi Tarfon, there is no validation of a hadas that its stem is broken off on top. A hadas does not have to be hadar, does not have to be beautiful like the esrig, and therefore, at least from this point of niktam, of being clipped off on top, Rabbi Tarfon says that is not a problem by a hadas. It's still kosher if it's clipped off on top. Now, Rabbi Tarfon says even if all 3 are clipped. So Rabbi Tarfon holds like Rabbi Shmuel originally held, that you need 3. He holds you need 3. But the 3 can be ketumim, they can be clipped off on top, because that doesn't invalidate the hadas. Rabbi Kiva says, Keshem shulav echad, esrig echad, just like you only need 1 esrig and 1 lulav, kach hadas echad arava echas. All you need is 1 hadas and 1 arava. That's Rabbi Kiva's opinion. Now again, that hadas should not be clipped on top, or else it's not going to be kosher. But at the end of the day, how many do you need of each one? All you need is 1. Okay, that's Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Hey.
Is that where we're holding? We hold?
Our practice is to have 3, three and 2. That's our practice.
Full.
What happens if you don't have, that's a different story. Okay, Mishnah Hey. Esreg hagazal v'yavesh pasal. An esreg, going back, we discussed the lulav, the hadas, the arava. Now we're going to discuss the esreg. Esreg hagazal v'yavesh pasal. A stolen esreg, or one that's dried out, invalid, as we explained previously. Shel asherah b'shlo nidachas. If it came from an asherah tree, meaning the tree was worshipped while the esrog was connected to it, or it's an esrog that comes from an nidachas, from the city that has to be destroyed because the inhabitants have become idol worshippers, puzzle. Again, it's invalid, because we see it, these things have to be burned. We see it as if it's burned, and therefore it's not going to have its proper size in order to be kosher. Shel arla, we consider it broken. Shel arla. Now, a new thing. If this esrog is arla is that after you plant a tree, the fruits that grow for the first 3 years are forbidden to eat or to have benefit from. Now, if you plant an esrog tree, the first 3 years of it, the esrogim are going to be arla. Can you use that for the mitzvah? I mean, you're not eating it. Are those forbidden to eat? Okay, it's forbidden to have benefit from. But you're not eating it when you're doing the mitzvah. And doing a mitzvah is not called a hana, a benefit that the Torah prohibits. But the Mishnah still says, shall arla puzzle. If it's of arla, it's invalid. We'll explain in a second. Shall truma tamei a puzzle. Let's say you have a bunch of esrogim. Now esrogim are fruits, and as much as we don't typically eat them, it is an edible fruit, and it seems there was a point of time that it was commonly eaten. Maybe there are places in the world that it is. So if you grew no esrogim, you have to separate truma from them. You got to take a separation for the kohen. That's called truma. Now, the separation of truma, no one can eat besides for a kohen, but a kohen can eat it. However, if let's say the truma becomes tummy, anytime truma becomes impure, come into contact with a source that makes it tummy, halachically impure, so then you're not allowed to eat it. So therefore, shall truma tameya, if the esrig is truma that became tamei, puzzle, it's invalid. You can't use it for the mitzvah. Why is that? And the answer is because we derive from the Torah, the words of the Torah, that the daled meaning of the four species, in order for them to be kosher for the mitzvah, they have to be usable in the way they are typically used. An esrig that's typically used, what's it typically used for? Eating. If you can't eat it because it's forbidden to eat, then you can't use it in its regular way. If I can't use it in its regular way, then I can't use it for the mitzvah either. The Mishnah continues, Shal Truma Tahira. Now let's say this esrog came from Truma, that's tar, it's pure, nothing's wrong with it. The kohen can eat it. Nonetheless, lo yitol, it should not be taken, it should not be used for the mitzvah. V'imnatal kasher, but if you took it and you used it for the mitzvah, it's kosher. What's the problem? I mean, you can eat it. The problem is a rabbinic issue. The rabbis were concerned with the following. If something is truma, then you have to guard it from becoming tummy. You're not allowed to let it become tummy. You got to guard it from becoming tummy. You got to guard it to make sure it doesn't come into contact with anything that's going to make it impure. Now, for a food to become impure, it first has to come into contact with liquid. If it comes into contact with liquid, then it becomes susceptible to tumah. If it doesn't touch liquid, you cut it off, you detach it from the ground, and it never touched any liquid. It will not become tummy. And when it comes to truma, you got to make sure, once it becomes truma, you need to make sure that it doesn't become tamei. Now, in the case of the esrog, our problem is like this. In the case of the esrog, our problem is that if you have this esrog and it was truma, so now when you're going to use it with the lulav, it was a very common practice to leave the lulav in water to keep it fresh. And which many people still do. Now, you're going to take that lulav out of the water, it's going to still be wet. You're going to put it together with the esrog, hold it together with the esrog and make the esrog wet. And if the esrog until now wasn't susceptible to tumah, which you want to make sure it's not, now there's a problem that you have a chance you're going to make it susceptible to tumah. And therefore, the Rabbanan, the sages said, don't use an esrog of tumah for your mitzvah. Don't use it. That's a precautionary measure, so you don't cause it to become susceptible to tumah. If you did use it and it wasn't tamei, you did the mitzvah. It's done. You still get the mitzvah because the whole thing is a precautionary measure. But, if you use it, you get the mitzvah because, again, it's edible, so it's still usable for the mitzvah. Now, another similar case, shel demai. Demai, as we learned previously, yes, I have an esrog of demai. So you have a bunch of esrogim that come from an amaretz. They're owned by an ignorant person. A person who is ignorant, the sages were concerned that maybe he may not have separated from his grain maisris. Truma, actually, we're not concerned about. But we're afraid that he didn't separate the tithes. And if you don't separate the tithes, it's forbidden to eat. So the Chachamim said, the sages instituted that if you buy grain from an amaretz, from an ignorant person, you can't eat it until you separate the maisris. Now, again, there's a lot of leniencies when it comes to demai, as we will soon see. Because according to Torah law, it's not like I have a doubt here on a Torah level about whether this is permissible to eat or not. Most ignorant people separate everything, and therefore I can rely on the majority from the Torah point to eat it. The sages wanted to be extra careful so that people don't come to eat tevel, which is forbidden to eat, and therefore they said you buy grain from an amaretz, you buy any produce from an amaretz, you can't eat it until you separate the tithes, not the maisris. Now, here you have an esrog of demai. You bought this esrog from an ignorant person. You can't eat it until you separate the mai. Can you use it for the mitzvah? So Beis Shammai poislin. Beis Shammai say, no, you can't use it for the mitzvah. It's not edible. You're not allowed to eat it. I mean, again, on a rabbinical level, you're not allowed to eat it. So you're not allowed to, if the rabbis forbid you to eat it, then you can't use it for your mitzvah. Ubeis Hillel machshirin. The Beis Hillel say it's kosher. It's a good esrog. Go ahead and use it. What's the issue? The issue is like this. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel have an argument as to whether the Chachamim, when they instituted the law of the Mai, did they also institute a leniency to feed it to the poor? According to meaning, maybe for poor people who need, they're poor, right? So instead of putting this stringency on them, we say for everybody else, we don't rely on the majority, but for the poor, we do rely on the majority. So Beis Shammai say there's no such law. It's always us. It's forbidden for everyone. Forbidden for everyone. You can't use it for an esrog. But Beis Hillel say no. Beis Hillel say the sages made that exception for the poor, and if the poor can eat it, then it's edible, just like truma. Truma can't be eaten by anybody, by everyone except for the Kohen, but it's edible to the Kohen. It's called edible. It's called usable the way it's meant to be used. So if the Mai can be eaten by the poor, it's also considered usable. And therefore, the Beis Hillel say, an esrog of the Mai, you can use it for your mitzvah without a problem. Last case. Shal Meiser Sheni b'Yushalayim. Now let's say it's Meiser Sheni. Meiser Sheni is that when you have your grain, after you separate the truma for the Kohen, and then a tithe after that for the Levi, a second tithing is Meiser Sheni. It is the second tithing, which most of the Shemitah cycle years is done, other than for 4 out of the 6 years of the Shemitah cycle, Meiser Sheni is taken. Meiser Sheni is holy in the sense that when you separate Meiser Sheni, you eat it, but you can't eat it unless you take it to Yerushalayim. Or if you redeem it onto money and take that money to Yerushalayim and spend it on food in Yerushalayim. So now you have this Meiser Sheni esrog, okay? And you want to use it. Now, outside of Yerushalayim, you can't eat it. Nobody can eat it outside of Yerushalayim. So outside of Yerushalayim, there's nothing to talk about. You can't use it for the mitzvah. But now we're talking about Meiser Sheni b'Yerushalayim. Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim. Still, the Mishna says, lo yito. Don't use it. Why? For the same reason that we don't want you to use an esrog of truma. Meiser Sheni also, if it becomes tameh, you can't eat it. We're obligated to guard it, to make sure to guard it from becoming impure. So again, if the fruit, it comes to contact with liquid, it becomes acceptable to tumah. If you use it with the lulav that could be wet, you're going to make it acceptable to tumah, if it wasn't acceptable until now. And therefore, we say, no, don't use it. You should not use an esrog of Meiser Sheni for your mitzvah. But if you use it kosher, it's kosher. Because at the end of the day, if it's not actually impure, then it could be eaten in Yerushalayim, of course, and therefore be kosher to use for your mitzvah. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.